Let's get joined up. I'm Wayne Kelly, and this episode is sponsored by Picklock Publishing, the imprint behind my debut novel, Safe Hands, which tells the story of Mickey Blake, a retired safecracker pulled out of retirement for one last job, and Hazel, a desperate mother driven to kill to protect her son from being sucked into a life of crime. It's out now on Kindle, paperback and audiobook, and if you use the link in the show notes, you can get a free 30-day trial of Audible and listen to the book for free. That's Safe Hands by me, W.A. Kelly. Right, advertising done. Let's crack on with the show. Now, where's that jingle? Joined up writing. Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly and it's episode 222 with inspirational commercial fiction writer Liz Fenwick, talking about her Cornish novels, her methods of research, her writing process and her advice for those of us struggling along the way. Here's a quick clip.
Even when you're not writing, you are writing. You know, it can be writing to go out and sniff a rose. It can be writing to go to a museum and see how other artists transpose what they see in front of them. And I think a lot of people think, oh, I have to get words down every day. And that pressure can become so great because if they've had 2 weeks where they haven't put pen to paper or fingers to keys, that they haven't been writing, but they have been writing.
We'll get into the interview in a second, but first a quick catch-up from me. I've been running hither and thither, both psychologically and physically, trying to keep too many plates spinning, to be honest, and it's starting to take its toll. I'm stressed out about book 2, as I've got looming deadlines, and I'm boring all of my writer friends, and even some of my non-writer friends about that, if truth be told. I've got some big plot knots to untangle, but just haven't been able to get the headspace to do it. That said, I will be going on a short holiday soon, so I'm hoping to press the reset button and get all of that on track. I think one of the reasons I'm so stressed about it is the result of what many authors have described on this podcast over the years as that difficult second book syndrome. My first book, Safe Hands, has been received and reviewed pretty well, especially when it comes to the plot and the surprise ending of the novel, which is great, but it has created a pressure, for me anyway, to do even better with the sequel. And I know it's just something I'll have to just get over and work through, so apologies for me venting on here. But equally, I thought some of you may be going through similar things and just wanted you to know that you're not alone. Yesterday I was at Newark Book Festival with a stall selling and signing my book and chatting to loads of amazing writers and readers, many of whom noted that I've got a sequel expected later this year, and this too gave me the fear and pleasure in equal measure, because it's great that people are kind of expecting something and that they're actually interested and they're actually noticing me. That's something. But anyway, I've just got to stop complaining and sort it out, which is probably a good segue to say that I'm going to Harrogate Crime Festival this week and then on that holiday that I mentioned. So there will be a few weeks without a new episode, but I will be back in August. I'm really looking forward to Harrogate, and if any of you are attending, do please come and say hello. I'll be in and around the tent on Friday and Saturday with a Hello Harrogate sign and badge and giving away free bookmarks to anyone who wants to come over and chat. There'll be lots of other writers and readers around too, so follow the Hello Harrogate hashtag on Twitter and post your own pics and updates and just let us know what you're up to. But regardless of whether you're attending that, I always love to hear from you, so drop me an email, wayne@waynekellywrites.com, and let's chat. I always reply. I've also finalised details for my Self-Publishing for Beginners day course, which is taking place in Leicester on August 31st, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. Right, let's get to today's interview, which is an inspiring chat with Liz Fenwick. So Liz is an American writer of commercial fiction living in Cornwall in England. Her books have been translated into 15 languages. She's published 9 novels and 2 novellas, taking her inspiration from Cornwall's history and landscape. And in 2017, she was named the Queen of the Contemporary Cornish Novel by The Guardian. Her debut novel, The Cornish House, was first published in 2012, and her latest book and 9th novel is The Secret Shore, which is out everywhere right now. So enjoy the chat, and I'll pop back at the end to wrap things up. Joined up writing. Okay, Liz, thanks so much for joining me on Joined Up Writing. I really appreciate it. So just to start us off, why don't you just give us a sense of what's going on in your writing world, but also your world at the moment? Obviously, you just had a bit of a stressful start to the morning, so...
Yes, lost cat, found cat covered in everything. What's going on in my life? I am revising the next book, and going through it. I've had somebody give me really formal advice this time. It hasn't gone to my editor yet.
I see.
And when I get that sort of feedback, I color code it and break it down to make it less dense. And so that's what I'm doing at the moment.
Brilliant. So hard work, is it?
Hard work, but this is when the book really begins to shine, but it's brain burning.
I know what you're saying. Yeah, there's lots of thought going into it and lots of trying to hold the whole thing in your head at the same time.
Yeah, because every time you change something, you've got to make sure that it works both ways.
Yeah, it's the chain reaction, isn't it? You do something, You think, oh, just to make this little change, and then it's the ripple effect all the way through the book.
I always think of it a bit like knitting. If you suddenly realize that you've finished a side of it and you've dropped a stitch down at the beginning, what's the best thing to do? Rip the whole thing out? Or do you carefully go down and pull it all the way through?
That's a good analogy, actually, yeah. And you often try to do the latter, but it doesn't always work out, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Well, why don't you tell us about the latest book that you've had out, which was The Secret Shore. Tell us a little bit about that.
Cracking adventure story. I have known about the SOE headquarters on the Helford River for years, probably since not my first visit down here in 1989, but it always struck me as odd, because if you've ever been to the Helford, it is just perfection. It looks like the most sleepy idyll that you'd ever come across. And to think that there was headquarters of secret operations, the water side of secret operations was based in this dozy little part of the world, fascinated me. And I really wanted to tell the story of these operations. And I thought with my third novel, A Cornish Stranger, I would. So I spent a month deep diving into the SOE and then wrote the book and didn't need it, which changed my research techniques after that. And it was only when I found my character, my protagonist, Mary, and knew that she was going to be a cartographer, make maps, because the unit was known locally as a cartography unit, that I found a way that I could begin to tell the story of the secret flotillas. But then what happened for me was a complete switch. When I did the deep dive into the research of what Mary would have had to study, how she would have studied it and everything else, and then what the map girls did during the war, I realized nobody's spoken about them.
Right,
There were all these women working in all aspects of geography, and nobody's mentioned them.
So it was ripe for some storytelling.
It was, and for me, because it's set so close to where I live, it became almost a love letter to the Helford River.
Brilliant.
And the area of Cornwall that I love so much.
Wow. So for people that might be interested in reading, so tell us, obviously it's The Secret Shore. So tell us what the actual premise, what's the setup of the story?
You have Dr. Meredith Tremaine, who has been seconded from the, let's see if I can get this right, Inter-Services Topographical Department. I'm dyslexic, so when I have to think through things like that, I really have to think hard, because inevitably I'll give you the words in the wrong order. And she was a lecturer at Oxford before the war, and during the war, at the start of it, she was writing the intelligence handbooks particularly on northern France, and also training officers in how to read a map. And that aspect of it. She was pinched by Ian Fleming and seconded into London. And there she was more involved with how maps were being used, as well as creating maps from the immediate intelligence photographs that came in. And all this is all at the beginning. I'm not ruining anything. News comes to her that her mother's gone missing. Now, her mother is French and an artist, and living down on a farm in Cornwall near the Helford River, where Mary's from. So to kill two birds with one stone, Fleming sends her down to look into what is going on with her mother, because there's an implication that her mother might be a spy, because, of course, she's foreign.
Wow. Yeah, of course. That's how it worked in those days.
Yes, especially during the war, everybody was a bit suspicious. And, you know, when you were actually foreign, you know, that, and her behavior had become odd. So Mary goes down to have a quick look into that. But there's things going on in this cartography unit that Fleming's not quite happy with, and he wants somebody to take a look. So she gets involved with these operations, and from her standpoint, she's wondering if the maps that they're using actually serve them, because you need to look at aspects. You need to look at who's using the map. What do they need from the map? And a bit like her brother, who was a pilot, his needs for a map are different than those operating on the sea and what they're encountering. So that was kind of the setup for the whole thing. And what you have is a cracking adventure story, and you see a little bit of what takes place on these secret operations that operate in the cover of darkness. So local people thought these guys were doing nothing.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Which is good. That's how it should be. Yeah,
exactly. So that's kind of the premise for the book. I'm not very good at summing it up in one word or, you know, a sentence or anything else.
Well, it's difficult, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a difficult thing to do. So tell us a little bit more about the cartography side of things. You mentioned there this is obviously something that's been bubbling away in your mind, and you even thought about using it for your previous novel. How did you approach the research? You said, you kind of hinted there that your approach to research had changed on the back of what happened last time. So how did you used to do it, and how do you do it now?
Well, when I was doing A Cornish Stranger, I thought I would save myself a lot of time if I did the heavy lifting research before I wrote the book. I now realize that this doesn't work for me. What I need is the bare minimum research done to write the first draft, and putting lots of capital X's in where I need to go in and deep dive. So in this circumstance, what I did was, knowing that she was a cartographer, I needed to know what you would have been studying in the 30s and so forth. And I also needed to know exactly what geographers did during the war. So that brought me to an academic paper written in 1986, written by an emeritus professor. And I read through the whole thing. It's fascinating. He mentions one woman, a Mrs. Godfrey. Now, he doesn't give her a first name. He doesn't say what she did. I mean, she could have made the tea for all I know. It wasn't until I'd finished the book that I realized, actually, Mrs. Godfrey was Vice Admiral Godfrey's wife, and she was one of the people who helped set up the Intertropical Services Department, and also worked at Bletchley Park. She was one of the first women to go to Cambridge, you know, all these things. I mean, she was an incredible woman doing the whole thing, and he doesn't even say what she did and her role in it. He just lists her name. And I thought there had to be women working there. And fortunately, one of my closest writing friends is a professor of history, Deborah Harkness, and she got on to a couple of librarians at various universities and suggested I read certain academic papers. So I did a deep dive into JSTOR, if you've done any academic research, and read countless papers on that. Also found a wonderful little pamphlet that had been written about Cornwall in 1945, well, researched beforehand, to see how geography has changed. So by the time I was writing the third draft of the book, I had probably done the equivalent of an A-level in geography. But not the current geography,
No.
the geography of the past. I read over 40 books.
Wow.
In order to get the story straight.
Yeah. And I suppose with it, because your kind of your thing that you work in is a historical fiction. So you must have a love of doing that stuff on some level, surely, because otherwise there's an awful lot of work to be approaching one of these books.
I think if I had my way, I'd do nothing but research, which is probably wise that I now only I target my research much more carefully. I still read to an excess, and that is to make me feel more comfortable, because I'm not a historian. Mm-hmm. And when for the previous book, The River Between Us, there are letters that come back from World War I from the fields of France. In order to write those letters, I read the complete annals of the oh God, I've gone blank on the name, the regiment that's out of Cornwall. Mm-hmm. It's a thick tome, and it's from 1914 until 1918. I read the whole damn thing.
Wow.
In order to find out which battalion, regiment, what were the letters like, that sort of thing. So I knew where everything was coming from. I didn't write a single scene in the battlefields of France other than the letters.
But you feel like it somehow seeped in and it gives you this confidence to write it.
It does. It's a bit like, I also read the industrial history of the Tamar.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it doesn't impact the novel in any way, but it impacted me as a writer to have the confidence.
Yeah. And I suppose it gives you other places that you could go if you wanted to, either in that book or, in elsewhere. Yeah. Absolutely. So have you always written in this genre? I know you've been published in this genre, but have you always written in that genre? When you started writing, did you think, I'll try science fiction? Right, okay.
No, I wrote contemporary fiction, contemporary women's fiction, but contemporary fiction. Always had a historical bit to it, because I have never left that out. And it wasn't until I wrote The Returning Tide, or was thinking about a story, that my editor said, you can do historical. Give it a go. So I did the dual timeline then. Absolutely adored doing it. And so my books are now either historical totally or dual timeline, so that I get the fun of doing the research.
Of going back, yeah. So you found your niche, if you like.
Yeah, and it took me quite a few books to do it.
Yeah. Well, let's take a little bit of a step back. Let's talk about that a little bit. How did you come to writing in the first place, Liz? What's your kind of earliest memories of writing?
I'm an only child, and therefore you have to learn to amuse yourself quite early on. And I loved books and I loved stories. And I think my earliest memories are wanting stories to continue and continuing them in my head, which then eventually led to writing my own. And I always wanted to do it. I look back, because I'm from the States, I look back to my high school yearbook at my senior year, and it said, always writing stories. That sort of thing. I did my degree in English literature. It was, because it was the US, you could do some fun things with it. So I had a concentration in medieval studies and creative writing.
Wow. So the kind of, the ingredients were there, the core ingredients were there right from the beginning. Yeah.
And for my senior thesis, I wrote 3/4 of a novel. And again, that was historical that I was writing. It was entitled The Irish Woman, and I was basing it on my grandmothers and my great aunts who had all come to the US. I never finished that book. My professor had given me her agent's name and told me to send it off to her, and I didn't. And when I came back to writing in 2004, 2005, when I came back to writing fiction, let me say, I found the notebook and I found her note in there saying, send it off. And I Googled the agent and I thought, oh my God, what did I not take advantage of at that time? Because this woman had been Frank McCourt's agent in New York. She's a big agent. And I thought, oh, wow. But of course, At 22, there were a couple of things. One, I didn't have the skin that was thick enough to take what you have to take as a writer. And two, I hadn't lived enough life in truth to write the stories that I actually wanted even then to write. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad that it took me all that time to go out live, to get knocked around enough. Because when I was writing back then, the world was very clear cut. It was very black and white. There was good and there was bad, and there was nothing in between. And I think until you live life, you don't realize how much most of life takes place in the in-between. Very few decisions that you make are clear cut. So it was coming to that point, and it was my godmother, may she rest in peace. I'd sent off, we were living overseas at the time, and I'd sent off a Christmas letter, as I did, this missive that went to people in the States that I'd left behind. And she said, when are you going to write that novel? And we were back here in Cornwall for Christmas and New Year. And New Year's Eve, we were going around the table, and everybody said, what is your, intention for this year? And I said to write more. And I didn't say to write more fiction. I knew that. And I then set out that year and I wrote a Mills and Boon. Mm-hmm. I did the research. I went to the supermarket in Dubai, bought the copies, read, and I completed it, which for me was the biggest thing.
Yeah.
Because I had 3/4 of a historical novel sitting. I had countless other beginnings of novels cluttering discs that can no longer be read, and all those things. And I completed it and I sent it off, and I got my first and only computer generated rejection. And thank God they did, because it's not where my voice fit at all. Looking back on that story, the two most interesting characters were two small children in it, mm-hmm. and they don't fit in a Mills and Boon. And I joined the Romantic Novelists Association because of it, and I got a critique. To this day, I don't know who she is, but she was. I think she's wonderful. I'm assuming it's a she, because the bulk of the membership is female, but not totally. And it said you need to look where your voice fits. It doesn't fit here. So I then set on a journey of writing a new book every year, because you have to for the new writers scheme. And it was a journey to find my voice. And what I would do was write a new one and then go back, having learnt new skills, and rewrite the old ones. So when in 2011, when I finally found my agent, it was with book 3, but I was writing book 7.
Wow. And that's powerful, isn't it? Well, it's obviously it's great because you've put the time and the practice and everything else, but also you've got this nice back catalogue of books.
And all of those books, bar the Mills and Boon one, which I will never look at again, although I still have a hard copy of it, have been published in one way or another.
That's great. That's similar to, I remember speaking to Laura Pearson, and she had a different journey to you in terms of, it was a bit stop-starty because she thought she'd got an agent and then something fell through and blah, blah, blah. But she just, the thing that's the same is that through the whole process and this journey that she was on and the rejection and everything else, she just kept writing books. And when it finally happened, after sort of 10 years of this, she had loads and loads of books, which, I mean, I think as we record this, I think Laura's just picked up like an 8-book deal or something. But I
know, it's crazy, isn't it?
But I think a big part of that, obviously, is that she has got this huge back catalogue as well as she's continued to. She just basically just continues to. She's quite prolific anyway, but she has got this back catalogue, and it's great that she's sort of kept going regardless of what was going on, as regardless of the outcome, if you like, which I think is a powerful message, isn't it?
I used to, in the days when people did blogs, my blog was Just Keep Writing. That was the title of it. And that's what I did. And, you have to keep writing. Even when you're not published, you have to keep going. And not just on one book. When you complete one, put it aside for a while, because you'll see it with different eyes when you've written another book.
And just keep trucking, basically.
Yeah.
So what do you remember when the big breakthrough came? What was that exactly? How did that happen? And how did you feel at the time?
I had gone to the first York Festival of Writing.
Mm-hmm.
And I was teetering on giving up trying to write for publication. At that point, I had had several requests for full from agents and direct from editors. And I realized they were good rejections that I got, because they all said, we'd like to see you next. And I thought, I don't know what I'm doing wrong, because the feedback that was coming back was all really, really different. And I couldn't see, which I later saw, they were all saying the same thing, but in a different way.
Yeah.
And I'd gone off to this festival of writing, and I had set up the one-to-ones because they were there. I had no intention of going with any of the agents per se that I was having one-to-one, but I wanted the feedback. So that was really important. And I was sitting in a seminar given by somebody whose name I now forget, and it was talking about literary fiction. And I was writing commercial fiction. But what I realized in the context of that, I'm sitting there thinking, that's what I haven't put in my fiction, because literary fiction is a part of me. And I was holding that out. And I thought, you can give that to your writing. I think, it's when you're in those early stages and you haven't been published and you haven't fully found your voice and everything else. And I realized on that conference that what I was aiming for was Daphne du Maurier meets Jodi Picoult, or Cornwall with Issues. And that was just such a breakthrough moment. That's not what I would quite write anyways, but to be able to finally put my finger on that was huge. And then I had a one-to-one with Ollie Munson, in fact, who I saw just this past week at the HarperCollins party. And I knew he wouldn't take my book, which was one of the reasons that I think, but his boss, Carol Blake, I was great friends with on Twitter, back in the days when Twitter was a pleasant place. And I was in the early days of book Twitter. I was on there as a pre-published person. And he said to me, why haven't you submitted to Carol? And I thought, because I'm scared to death. And I realized he was going to go back into the office and talk to Carol. So I thought, oh God.
Which is massive,
so I dropped her an email and saying, I'm not ready to submit yet. This is what I'm aiming for. And she said, if you get anywhere near that, I want to see it. And that was in April. And the other thing I did, I think before you get published and you're working really hard, you can hit a plateau. And I was at that plateau because I couldn't see what people were saying. So I actually stumped up and got a professional critique of my book from Cornerstones. And that was 28 pages. And it was also the marked up text. And that was the moment that I could see all these people were saying exactly the same thing, but in different ways. So I worked on that.
And what were they saying, do you think? What did you kind of take from that?
I don't remember anymore. Terrible thing to say. But
in general terms, though, there must have been, as you say, if you felt like they were all sort of saying the same thing but worded differently.
I think it was that I wasn't going deep enough. I was keeping it on too much on a surface level.
Mm-hmm.
That would be probably what it was. And what I did was dive deeper into it and look more closely at characters' emotions and how they acted and everything else. This was before I became a craft book junkie, which I am now. And my writing was very much instinctual. Yes, I had done some creative writing back at university, but it was taught very differently at the time. So that probably was what it was. So I cleaned it up and I sent it off to 4 agents. And I was sitting in Dubai at the time. And by lunchtime, Dubai time, I'd had my first request for a full.
Wow.
And Carol was one of the agents. And it was one of the funniest things, because she used to love to tell this in her lectures that she used to give. I wrote her and I said, Carol, as your friend and not as a potential client, I've had a request for full, and your book from pitch to publication doesn't tell me what to do in this circumstances. And she wrote back, as your friend, you then notify all the other agents that this is the case. One agent pulled out when she heard that the others were interested, because she didn't want to get into a
war
auctioning type thing.
Yeah.
But I had 3 agents that wanted me. And that's when Jenny Haddon, who is a member of the RNA, has written countless Mills and Boons, and also worked for the World Bank. One of the most clever women I've ever met. And she said to me, what do you need from an agent? You're in a situation to pick an agent. What do you actually need? And I looked at them and I thought, well, Carol's my dream. And I heard that she was an editing agent, and she's also fierce on so many of the other things. So when she came back, it was actually on the Saturday, which was in Dubai at the time, although the weekends changed, it was our Sunday. So we'd been out for quite a boozy lunch. And I came back and looked at my emails, and I was trying to sober up very quickly. We're walking around and I kept going, oh my God, Carol agent wants to represent me. And Carol agent, and Chris is like, shut up, you sound like an M&S ad. So I was trying to sober up so that I could write back. And by Monday I had signed the contract. And that was on the 14th of February. And by the 17th of March, I had my first deal, which was the Netherlands.
Superb.
Yeah.
So it was a real roller coaster then in the end.
Well, it's interesting because I think it shows you how things can change, and if you put your work in. But what was interesting, she submitted to 7 UK editors, only one grabbed it, but yet it went to auction in Germany.
Yeah.
So, and it was the Cornish House that which was book number 3.
And why do you think that was? Do you think it was maybe the location was what did it for them? The very sort of quintessentially English kind of setting. What did you ever sort of get a sense of what that might be initially? That why it was so
you mean
strong?
for Germany?
Yeah.
Germany, they love Cornwall. They're huge Rosamund Pilcher fans. But having said that, Germany's not my best market.
Right.
Sweden is.
Right.
I earn more money from Sweden than I do from the UK.
Right. Wow.
Yeah.
And have you ever been able to put your finger on that? It's just, or again, it's just, you just think it's just one of those quirks.
It was really interesting because they invited me over and I headlined a festival.
Wow.
And they had somebody to pick me up at the airport. All the things that have never
you kind of dream of.
Yes, I had the dream author experience. My editor was there on the morning I was giving the talk and took me to lunch and did all those things, and then took me to dinner when we were in, Stockholm and things like that. And I asked, well, actually, it was my husband who was with me. He said, why Cornwall? And because what has become clear is that I've created a whole sort of subgenre in Sweden on Cornwall.
Right. Wow.
And there, I love when I'm classified. I'm classified as feel-good fiction.
Right.
And I think, and having the festival was the feel-good festival. And what was fascinating about it is it wasn't just love stories. It was crime as well. But the lighter end of crime, not the dark Scandi.
Yeah, sort of the capery type thing.
Yeah. So I thought, actually, I really like that title of feel-good fiction. Yeah. My husband says, I'll drag you through hell, but in the end, you will have a hopeful ending before you get there.
Well, that's the sign of a good story. So Cornwall, you said, your husband just asked that very question when we were in Sweden, but I'm asking you the same thing. I mean, I love Cornwall, don't get me wrong. I can totally understand it. But for you, especially because you've kind of mentioned that you originally, your roots are back in the States. So why Cornwall for you? Why has it become your de facto setting?
Cornwall is my muse. The Mills and Boon was not set there.
Interesting.
So that's probably why it didn't fly. There was something about it. As I look out the window, I see stories in the landscape, which makes me sound insane. probably am. I think most writers are. And the more I explored and the more time I spent down here, the more I realized how rich and ripe it is for stories, between the folklore and the history and the landscape. And it just inspires me.
It's as simple as that, really.
Yeah.
And are you interested in looking at any other locations, or is there anybody at any other locations that have kind of tempted you, trying to tempt you away from your other half?
You go to some places and you feel stories.
Yeah.
I always felt Edinburgh was that way, but I would not even begin to try that. People often said, because we spent almost 11 years in Dubai, and I was thinking, no, that doesn't inspire stories in me. There has recently been something that has triggered a well of stories in me, and it's part of the research that I did for the novel that's coming out next year.
That sounds intriguing.
It is intriguing. It's fun. It's you have to stretch your writing muscle, and I used to always do that during Nano. I used to begin a novel that wasn't for a publisher. Just an opportunity to write something different, because I think it's really important to do that, because otherwise you can get bored.
Mm-hmm.
Forget getting stuck in a rut. You can get bored writing that type, similar stories all the time, same but different. And so this really kind of excited me. I could see the potential, but what's going to happen with it, I don't know. And it will be in between my contracted novels that I do it.
It's interesting, going back to you talking about the first attempt, and your kind of instinct was Mills and Boon, and I guess it comes to that commercial side of things. What would you say that's fair? Is that why you think you went for that particular?
I love stories, so that's one reason. Two, they're short.
Yeah, they are, aren't they? Yeah, that's one of the things.
You're talking 50, 60,000 words. The Secret Shore is 125,000 words. So actually, I think it's a really good exercise for anyone to try and write a Mills and Boon, because they're incredibly difficult, because the couple is going to be together. So you have got to find a legitimate reason to keep them apart for 50,000 words and still make it satisfying. It's not easy.
No, I agree. I think anything that's kind of got those rigid genre expectations, I think that, like as you say, I think that's actually a good writing exercise, whether it's in that genre or another genre, or whether it's a short story or whatever. But I think that can be quite a good way to, as you mentioned, stretching your certain writing muscles, building up certain writing muscles.
I think the more you play, and the more fun you have in that, the more it strengthens the main core of your writing.
Yeah, absolutely. So just talk to us a little bit about your actual process. So has it changed? I mean, presumably you've been doing it for quite a while now, and you've mentioned, as you mentioned, you've written a lot of books. So how would you say it's changed, if at all, from that first published book to where you are now, which is like book 9 or whatever it is?
Okay, I used to be a complete pantser.
Yeah.
A total, complete, wrote instinctively. And now, especially in the early days when I had to do a book a year, I had to find a way to I didn't have the time to write myself into plot holes and to fix it. So I'm not a planner, but I always know the end. I say that. I'll explain to you what happened with The Secret Shore. But I would always know the end I was writing to. And with the contemporary stories, that was a fairly straightforward process, because I have some idea of what plot was going to take place and that sort of thing. So I would start out with, I'd need the title of the book. I'd need the name of my protagonist. I'd need to know where that protagonist would end up at the end. And potentially I might know of a couple of key events. So that was how I did most of my contemporary ones as I moved on. Historical demanded something different of me because you're working around actual events. You can't create them, although you can move them, as I did in The Secret Shore. What happened to me with The Secret Shore was I had my character. I didn't really have a title, but that was okay. I'm now far enough along that I can write without a title, although I prefer to have one. And I wrote 40,000 words, and I realized it wasn't right, and I deleted them. I wrote 55,000 words. The book was due in October, and this was the beginning of August. And I had a dark night of the soul. And I got on to my two best writing buddies, and we did a FaceTime. So it was Deborah Harkness and Bridget Cody. And I explained what the problem was. Because as I had researched Mary's journey, what she would have had to do to become what I wanted her to be, she wouldn't have the ending that I was writing to.
Yeah, I know this feeling.
And I had to decide, did I change her, or did I trust her and just write the story as it would be for her? The easier thing would have been to change her. But in the end, I thought, she's too interesting. I'm going to trust her. And by the almost the end of October, I had saved 5,000 words out of that 50, which was mostly landscape description. And I had written a very raw but complete draft of the story to say to my editor, well, here it is. I need to clean it, but we have a story. And this is the first time I wrote not knowing how the book would end.
Right. And how did that feel? Terrifying.
Terrifying. Whereas the book I'm writing at the moment, because it's a new contract, I had to put together a synopsis.
Right.
And I hate doing that. I can write a synopsis after I've written the first draft, but to do it before you've even written the book, but it helped this time. So I'm now thinking before my next book, which I'm getting to the point where it's rearing its head quite insistently, that I might have to do a synopsis for that, just to make it simpler for myself. Not that it's a straitjacket, but just guidelines.
Yeah. Well, I think all of that's encouraging though, Liz, like for anybody that's listening, that's depending on where you are in your writing journey, because it's kind of my suspicion that it does, for most people, it does always change. And not only that, I think it's almost, some books need a different process, like, for whatever reason. The truth of the matter is you just have to do what you have to do to get whatever that book is across the line, don't you? And it's not always going to be exactly as you would have liked to have done it, it's safe to say.
If I turned the camera around, which people aren't going to see anyways, there is a Post-it note on my screen that says, you are a new writer for every book because it's a new book. That's a great
note to make. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I picked it up out of, as I mentioned, I am a craft book junkie. Yeah. And there is a wonderful book. Is it The Slow Art of Fiction or A Writer's Journey? I'll have to find it for you and send you it. And it is filled with lots of wisdom. I think it comes from the art of slow writing, which normally I don't do, but sometimes it is good to write and think and take more time in the writing process. It's hard when you're on a book a year, though. That makes it very difficult.
That's what I was going to say. The deadline I think that changes things. I think sometimes it's not just the fact that you're aware of the deadline there. I think it's sort of knowing that there is an actual something that you've got to hit. I think even if you have logically, well, I know I've got enough time, but just knowing that there is a hard stop, I think sometimes can mess with you psychologically. Would you say that's fair to say?
I would say it's very fair to say. It can freeze you.
Yeah, into inaction. Yeah, definitely. And I'm having the thing that you described there with you, getting stuck in the novel and writing just for the sake of writing. That's exactly where I am at the moment with the book that I'm writing, and it's horrible. And I'm writing lots of words, and I keep throwing them away. Well, not throwing them away, but throwing them into another file. I use Scrivener, so I've kind of got a folder that I've got in Scrivener, and I just put everything in there. Sometimes I take things out and whatever. But I've done tens of thousands of extra words. Where are you going with this? And it is basically all because I am not quite absolutely happy with the end, like as in where I'm actually going. I've kind of,
Hmm.
I keep thinking, yeah, it's going to be something like this, but that's not good enough. Um, because it's just, I keep writing myself into these plot holes,
Plot
and then
holes.
where are you going with this? No, well, what if you do that, then this happens, and that means that they can't do this, and blah blah blah. Complication, 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 and not good complications, that are interesting for the reader, and they just make my life very difficult. So I just have to. I'm at the point now where I'm having to stop and think. Right, what?
I'd recommend two things. Well, first, I'd say sometimes you have to write that stuff in
Yeah,
order to get to the good stuff.
yeah,
There's a lot of times that, particularly when I go through my first drafts, I'm thinking, what was I writing here? And I realized the next bit is really good, and I needed to write that
yeah. To get
mess
to it, yeah,
to get to it. The other thing I found really helpful, not the way she recommends in the book, doing it from the start, because that leads me wrong, but to go through and tighten a draft, is Story Genius by Lisa Cron.
hmm
Um, Particularly her scene cards, the way she makes you think through and process through where to go to next.
hmm
So I'd suggest that. Give that a
yeah,
try on the scene that you're
yeah,
working on at the moment and see where logically
yeah. Play
you
it
go
out.
to next.
Yeah, sort of game it out almost.
Yeah.
To think where it goes. Yeah. So yeah, I can completely, and I think it's funny because obviously you're talking about you've got the note that you've got reminding yourself that for each new book you're a new writer essentially. The flip side of that coin, which is something that I heard somebody mention, it might have even been on Twitter recently, was that also reminding yourself that you have done this before, because sometimes I
Yes.
think, I know it sounds like it's the opposite of what you've just said, but sometimes I think there is that as well. It's, how the hell am I going to get to the end of this book? So I just don't think I'm going to be able to do it. And you have to remind yourself that you felt exactly the same way about probably everything else that you've ever written at some point in the book.
Absolutely. I mean, I look above. I've got my mother's, well, actually, my grandmother's old desk here. I'm missing the top half, but it's a drop down. And above there, I've got my awards and I've got my books and some of my foreign translations. And I think, I've done this.
Yeah,
I can do it again.
absolutely.
And they were all muddy. The other thing, I think it comes out of slow writing, and it's another thing that Deb made me do, is a process journal. Because Biddy's been with me my whole writing journey, and she always, I was like, oh, this is absolute, and I won't say the swear, and she's like, oh, are we 20 or 40,000 words in? you know and she knows my thing, but it's really, I've been now writing the process journal, not as diligently as I should, but I was particularly diligent, and I can see going through a couple of books now what my process is and how it varies from book to book and how I feel. And I'd suggest that for anyone. Pick a nice notebook. We're writers, we like nice notebooks, and write in it daily at the beginning of the day or the end of the day. You can state your intentions, you can state what's worrying you, all those things can go in that place. And then you can look back and think, I've hit the 30,000 word plot problem,
Yeah.
because you do the same things. I mean, every book is different and the needs are different. There was a wonderful book, it's one on character. It was it the first version or the second version? He did two. And he mentions that when you start writing, you have strengths. And by the time you've written 3-4 books, you've strengthened up other things. You've learned that. So you almost have to go back to what your strengths were in the
To
first.
work
You
on them
realize that
again.
those need to be tuned up. And I think that's really useful to know as well.
Yeah, and I think just this, I mean, I think anybody that's written for any amount of time knows this anyway, and they probably don't need it to be stated. But I think it's just this thing that I think probably before you start writing, the same as before you start learning any new skill or you do painting or whatever. Or I think this idea that one day you'll attain this certain level, and it's like, I'm finished. You know, I am the finished article now. I think it's a bit like life. I think you think that when you're growing up. I think you've got this idea in your head that one day you'll be an adult, whatever that is. You know, you'll be this finished version of this adult, and then you realize as you get older and you go through the decades, you're like, no, that never happens. You never actually finish. You're just on, you know, at the risk of being cliched, you're just on the journey, aren't you?
Yes, and you don't want it to end. I mean, the only time you are finished is if you suddenly retire. And very few writers retire because we still have more to say.
Absolutely. So, as you say, you kind of came to publishing. I mean, I say late, but I don't think it is nowadays anyway, because lots of people don't get published until their late 40s, 50s, 60s and beyond nowadays. But you did come to it a bit later. Is there anything that you would go back and tell your younger self to do, either do differently or say, yes, that was a great thing to do, keep doing it? What advice would you give your younger self, do you think?
I would have encouraged myself to continue keeping a journal, which I didn't. I would love to have had a journal during the years that we traveled and the years of raising my children, to go back and to tap into that, because the journals I have are great for helping me to write angsty teenagers and I said the swear again, poetry,
okay.
and all sorts of things like that. It would be nice to have some of those different years chronicled. So keeping a journal, not a diary as such, but a journal of various things would be one of the things I'd say to myself.
Yeah, to get and a sense of what you were thinking.
Yeah. I speak to a lot of women. I really put I bow down to them if they can write when their children are young. I wanted to, but it wasn't until my youngest was actually having more than an hour in a classroom that I could truly have that. So when she went into reception was when I really started writing properly. And I think of Stephen King's great book on writing, and which first time I picked it up, I couldn't get on with it. It was one I kept on the shelf because so many people had recommended it. And I read it finally through, and what a fantastic book it is. But I still laugh because he talks about going into a room, closing the door, looking at the wall. And I read that, I thought he has a wife.
Yeah, straight away. Yeah, exactly.
Because the laundry still has to be done, the bathroom's cleaned, dinner made, and all those things. So also to be kind to yourself, because life does have to continue and it will interrupt. And even when you're not writing, you are writing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think a lot of people think, I have to get words down every day. And that pressure can become so great, because if they've had 2 weeks where they haven't put pen to paper or fingers to keys, that they haven't been writing, but they have been writing. It can be writing to go out and sniff a rose. It can be writing to go to a museum and see how other artists transpose what they see in front of them and translate it onto a canvas, or listen to a piece of music. Writing every day is great. Absolutely. If you can even get 10, 15 minutes in, it helps with that writing muscle so that it isn't sore when you get your fingers back on the keyboards. But I think people will let the guilt that they haven't written stop them from going forward.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's great advice. And so you obviously, I can see, people listening to this won't be able to see, but I can see lots of books behind you, your books and whatever. But obviously, being a writer, books, and you've mentioned loads of craft books as well. But there's a segment,
bookcase of them.
Yeah. Oh wow. Yeah.
Those are craft books.
Yeah, exactly. I can tell with all the different ones you've dropped, because lots of people talk about craft books, but you've named even ones I've not heard of, so that's brilliant. But in terms of books, there's a segment on the show that I've got called
It's the book that saved my life. Yeah, it's the book that saved my life.
If I said that phrase to you, what would that kind of conjure for you? Is there a particular book or books, non-fiction, fiction, could be from when you were young, it could be from recently, but what's the first thing that kind of comes to your mind?
There were 2 books I would say come to my mind. One is not I don't know what you want to call it. The Alchemist. I can't pronounce his last name, by Paul Coelho.
Okay, we'll go with that.
It's about as close as I can get. It was given to me by my brother-in-law, who doesn't read. Fiercely clever, unless it's a business thing. And I read it, and it was handed to me at a time when I needed to know that sometimes the universe does hand you things, and it's what you do with them when it's handed to you. So that really was at a key turning point for me. And it's a book I've handed to other people but then I think of, having wanted to be a writer all my life, but wasn't sure where I fit. And I read Light a Penny Candle by Maeve Binchy. And I thought, that's what I want to write.
So that was the thing that connected you to your particular genre and where you were going. Yeah.
Yeah. And God, that came out ages and ages ago. So I was, I was probably in uni or high school when it came out, and I read it. I thought, oh, yes. So yeah, that's where I am on that.
Oh, that's brilliant. And as we kind of move towards wrapping things up, along the way, along your creative journey or whatever, has there been one piece of creative advice that's kind of stood out for you? Or it might be something that you live by yourself or something that somebody else has told you, but what's one piece of creative advice?
Just one.
You can give me more if you like, but if you've got...
Well, the first thing I'd say is read. Read widely. Don't just read in the genre. If you're not enjoying a book, especially if you're early in your journey, read it and discover why you're not enjoying it, because you learn as much from those books as you do from the good ones. Because I think sometimes reading a book and you think, oh God, I can never do that, can put you off. Whereas sometimes you read something and you think, oh, you learn
I could do this.
So,
yeah.
The other thing is, as I say, I'm a dyslexic. And the best thing for, people say to read your work aloud. Me reading my work aloud doesn't work because words move on pages, and I won't see missed words. So I have the computer read the book to me. And particularly when I was first starting, the only voice you had was Microsoft Sam. And let me tell you, clunky prose in the automated sound of Microsoft Sam is enough to turn you in your grave, even though you're not in it. But you really hear things that you might not see. And I think that is a tool that we now have. We have much better voices, but they still can't put emotion. Well, they will soon with AI. It's all coming. But, I don't really want that. I want to hear the prose, and I can hear mistransitions, not just the missed words and everything else, but it gives me a distance to the work. Because if you're on a contract and you're doing a book a year, you haven't got the leisure to put it aside for a year, ideally, or even a month, or even a week many times. If you can get a weekend out of it, you're doing well. So you have to find ways to make the book not yours so that you can edit it. I always think, by the time I've got to the proof pages stage of every book I've written, I hate them. I hate the book with such a passion, it's beyond belief. But it's a great place to be when you're editing. Because no longer are those gorgeous bits of prose your darlings. You're
it's
just
cold,
yeah. And so I think that's, anything that can give you that distance is a valuable tool.
That's really good.
I could go on about writing tips. I mean, I could do a whole podcast on writing tips.
Well, maybe we do that one day. Oh, no, that was great, Liz. That's really, really good. So just as we kind of wrap things up, just tell people, remind people about the latest book, obviously, and they need to go off and buy that, but also tell them where they can find out more about you online and your socials and whatever.
The best hub is my newly designed website, lizfenwick.com, and you can find about all sorts of things. And you can also find my social media links, because for my sins, I'm on Instagram, I'm on TikTok, I'm on Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it, and I'm also on Facebook. I'm everywhere. So latest book, which has just been optioned for a film, which is deeply exciting.
Wow.
The Secret Shore. And also talk about stretching writing muscles. I was asked last year about this time, no, it's probably August, to write a ghost story on spec.
Yes, we
And
didn't get to
that
that
is
yet.
now out. 13 Cornish ghost stories. And that was a joy to write something that was so out of my comfort zone. And I think that was really, really good.
Yeah, that's great. So they can find all that stuff. Well, I'll put your link in there, lizfenwick.com. I'll make sure they can find that and get all your links on it. But for now, Liz, thanks so much for coming on the show. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks for coming on Joined Up Writing.
Oh, thank you.
Joined up writing.
There you go. Thanks again to Liz, and I'll put all of the links in the show notes. So that's it for this week, other than me reminding you to sign up to my workshops newsletter to get cheaper, earlier access to my course content, and also drop me a line at waynekellyWrites.com because I'd just love to hear from you anyway. And obviously don't forget to subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcasts from, and then you can have the show downloaded automatically each time. And remember to leave us a nice rating and review because it does help other people to find the show, and just keep telling your friends. That would be amazing. So I'll see you in August, but thanks for listening this week. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.